We'd like to put a photo up on the screen and show you the title of my sermon, And Who Knows But That You Have Come. Where does that come from? Who said that? Plus a bit more. That's what the ... dot's all about. I'll give you a clue. The next photo will probably show it, except, yes, I do need to turn it on. It's on. Right. Who said it? What was it? What's the full sentence? You may have thought, well, perhaps that's got something to do with it. Oh, I've come to worship today, or I haven't come to worship. Is it that? No, it's not that. Here's the full sentence. And who knows that you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Who said it? Mordecai. Okay. And he said it to who? Esther. And it is a great story. And I'm going to use it as an introduction to a modern day, 500 years ago. But anyway, it's out of the Bible times, a more recent story. But let's have a look at this story first. For example, the picture that you're looking at is actually a picture, a painting from somebody who is showing there Queen Esther, who's come to the king, who's put the scepter out and she's touching it. What went before that part of the story? Well, what went before it was, it's interesting, it fits into our context today because right in the middle, about where the word media is there, is where the country of Iraq is and where the conflict is and where we've been seeing so many devastating pictures of destruction there in Iraq. But the kingdom of Persia, which covers more than the area of Iraq, you can see it extended during its prime time, 200 years. It extended east and west and became a great empire. And there were some people who were left behind from the Babylonian captivity of 100 or so years before. And amongst them, there was a man by the name of Mordecai who was serving in the palace of the king, and his young cousin, whose name was Hadassah, which simply means myrtle in the Israeli language or in the Jewish language that she has come from, but was given the name Esther, meaning star, as a Persian name. And so here we have young Esther, an older cousin who has basically fostered, adopted. He's now her guardian. And we have the two of them having cause to interact. They interacted a lot, obviously. In fact, I think this picture probably would illustrate that as well, that they had many a communication together and talked about life, talked about God, and talked about captivity, and talked about their experience there as not hostages, but certainly in Persia at that stage, and didn't seem to be able to escape. All right, but then there came that terrible news. Before that, of course, you've got the king is rather hostile of that his first wife, and her name was Vashti. You recall that she refused to come and display her glory in front of everybody else at the banquet and the party. And so the king of the day, whose name is Xerxes if you're looking in the NIV or the New Living Translation, and some other modern translations as well, but the King James and the older translations tend to go with another name called Xerxes, but it's the same person. And so Xerxes is the first name that I gave you. It's Ahasuerus is the name that you find in the King James translation. And he needed another wife. And you know the plan, and how that the plan was arranged for all the beautiful girls to come and to be part of the king's experience, and he'd choose one. And it seems that they got no further. The king got no further than Esther, and this is the one. And he marries Esther, and she is crowned. And so that's the story as we have it. But a little further down the track, things turned very sour because Haman, the villain of the story, he sets up a gallows which was meant for Mordecai because Mordecai wouldn't bow down and respect his higher position, so to speak, by bowing down to him. And so the gallows was intended for him. And then in the process of the rest of that part of the story playing out, an edict goes out because of Haman's hatred of Mordecai and his people, and that were the Jewish people. Excuse me. And apparently there were a number of them still around. And he managed to convince the king that it would be appropriate to exterminate all of them. Well, Mordecai got the news before Esther did. And by the way, Mordecai had told Esther, do not tell anyone your heritage, because it might muck the plan up. That was the initial instruction to Esther. But now we come to the stage where Mordecai and Esther sit down and they have a fairly serious discussion. And he says, you are the only person who can solve this. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. And so Esther eventually accepts that challenge, goes in before the king, and the king holds out the scepter, which accepts her. And then you recall how that the trap, as it were, was laid. There's lots of plots in this story, actually. The trap, as it were laid, and the king and Haman come to the banquet a couple of times until finally the truth is revealed. And Haman hangs on his own gallows. That's in a nutshell the story of Esther. It took about 6 or 8 chapters to tell all that. But the theme, I think, of the book of Esther is that very verse, chapter 4 of Esther and verse 14. And who knows but that you have come to royal possession for such a time as this. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt sometimes in your life, I've been placed here for a special purpose? Or have you felt on the other side of the coin, I have no idea what I'm doing here? Then remind yourself of what's in this story, because it's amazing how God can maneuver and bring great things out of things that did not seem so desirable to you. And look, in my zest for sharing stories from the Protestant Reformation period, I hit upon a story that I really believed brings this theme out very soundly. And this is the story of one lady by the name of Catherine Parr, who I'm sure echoes the experience of Esther in the Persian court. And that's whose story that I'd like to have a look at today. Catherine Parr certainly is I believe for many people, very overlooked in terms of what happened in the story of Henry and his 6 wives. In fact, I must admit, until recent times, and my real introduction to it, and I'll give credit for this because the latter part of my sermon will reflect the chapter in here that's based on Catherine Parr. And this is the first of 3 books written by Sukershan, and it's called Sister in Arms. And it deals with women of the Protestant Reformation and the important people that the parts that they have played in the Reformation. And she has dug out now 3 bookfuls, put them into a kind of like a religious novel, using the historical facts. And I'm always interested to pull out the historical facts from the stories and put the whole thing back together again in my language. And so that's where we're going today, is to follow the story of Catherine Parr. But before we get to Catherine, you need to understand this man. And you need to understand what happened with his 6 wives, because it provides the backdrop to really understand Catherine's story and why it was that she could claim, who knows that I have come to the kingdom, to the royal palace, but for a special time like this. All right, Henry VIII, You can see there his period of reign. It was a reasonably long reign in English history. In 1535, he brought into Parliament the Act of Supremacy, and that brought a break from Rome to the English people. Instead of the Pope being the head of the church, in England now we're going to have the King, the head of the church. All right? And that Act of Supremacy became a catalyst for starting the Protestant Reformation in England. But Henry himself actually never joined the Protestant Reformation. In fact, he continued to oppose right up to the end anybody who stuck their head up and supported Protestant positions, particularly on the communion and a few other things like justification by faith. They angered him, and people were excommunicated for it. And here you can see he's organised Cardinal Wolsey to burn the writings of Martin Luther. And so we see that he had a very mixed sort of a view of things. And this becomes a part of the story, by the way, with Catherine Parr. The other thing that's important about Henry is to understand that he had 6 wives. Now, maybe the photograph there hasn't really highlighted these 6 wives that are standing there in front of him. But these are the 6 wives who Henry married over a period of about 30 plus years. And they create quite a story and an enormous background for Catherine's story, being the last of these 6 wives. So there's the name of them. 3 Catherines, notice, by the way. He must have liked that name. But I've found out also it was a very common name back then, Cathy, not as common as it is today. But and by the way, mostly always spelt with a C, but alternatively can be found spelt with a K. In fact, even Catherine Parr, when she signed anything officially, she used a K. But every other time her name was recorded as C, Catherine Parr. So here are these 6 wives. And the CP, by the way, above their heads indicates whether they had Catholic or Protestant leanings, which you can see is going to make a very significant part of the story. All right, so the story starts with Henry then. He marries Catherine of Aragon, and there's quite a story behind that. And this is what you would say his steady wife, 24 years. I mean, the next 5 only spelt over 12 years. So this was a very steady relationship in one sense, but there was a problem with this relationship. Catherine of Aragon never produced for Henry an heir to the throne, and that heir had to be a son. And because of that, Catherine did have some children. In fact, as is identified there, one of those was Mary Tudor, obviously, who does become a queen at a later stage, but that's a part of Catherine's story. I'll bring that in later. And both Mary is reflecting her mother's religion, strongly Catholic. All right? But because she cannot produce a son, Henry decides it must be her fault, and so he decides she has to be divorced. And so he seeks a divorce from the Pope. The Pope was the only person who could give him a divorce. And so he seeks a divorce. The man that he uses primarily in that process was a man by the name of Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the church in England, but strong, passionate leanings towards Martin Luther and the Reformation. And Henry uses this man because one of the things that Thomas Cranmer is on about is that all this money going out of England, going into the church's coffers and across, to the Pope's residence, it's not right. It needs to be stopped. And so he and Henry, with different causes behind their reasoning, have the same objective: break from England, from the Pope. And so, even though there was a representation to the Pope for the break of that marriage and a divorce, It never came about. And one of the reasons why is the Pope, Clement the Seventh, he had just lost a war against the king of the Holy Roman Empire, and that king's name was Charles V, who happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And he knew that if he pronounced this as a divorce, guess what's going to happen? He's going to get further reprisals against him from the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And so he wouldn't issue the divorce. And as a result of that, Henry made himself the head of the church in England. Therefore, this little picture gives you a good idea that the Reformation in England, in a way, came about by two men with very different perspectives, and they became closest friends to one another, although one had a very strong leaning towards the Protestant cause, and the other was very loyal to the church of his day. And so now suddenly in England, we have a situation where the church of England, instead of having the Pope at the head of the church now has the monarchy, the king. And Henry can bring about his own divorces. He can bring about whatever he likes as king. Henry might sound very much like somebody else, you know. I just, as you go along in this story, you think, oh, wow, it's so similar. But anyway, so this was Henry. And it's time for him now to get another wife. And that wife is Anne Boleyn. She had been a maid of honour to Catherine. And so Henry had been obviously spying out the land for some time. And they were married 3 days after the legal divorce was pronounced by Thomas Cranmer. Well, this part of the story is a little more interesting because in this case again, Anne Boleyn is not able to come up with a son, but she did give birth to a daughter who survived, and that daughter's name was Elizabeth. Now, while Anne Boleyn herself was kind of a mixture of Catholic and Protestant leanings, it's going to be interesting to see that later on Elizabeth is going to play a very big role in what happens in the future, but Catherine Parr comes back into the story again. All right? Very strong leanings towards Protestantism, as we mentioned. She influenced Henry, for example, on that act of supremacy that we were talking about, that Henry and Thomas Cranmer were working on. But in addition to that, she continued to support Henry on his second step of breaking and taking that money away from England, and that was what was known as the dissolution of the monasteries, because all the Catholic institutions, in fact, is it here or is it a little further down the track? We will be, is it on this? There we go. Here, there are 625 monastic communities in England and Ireland and Wales that were dissolved by Henry at that stage. And you can appreciate why now the Pope's pretty upset with what's happening in England. For example, if you go into, and this is a photograph, one of the few photographs that I have supplied for this presentation, but if you go into the St. Peter's at the Vatican there, and you find this particular art piece, very large piece, known as the Alexander the Seventh Monument, and the woman on the far right of that monument is called Truth, representing the church, and you see her just a little bit enlarged in the middle of the picture. But then what's of interest is if you look across to the right-hand photograph, there you will see that her foot is on England, but coming out of England, there's a tack, a prickle, and the toe of Truth, the church, has been hit by the pain that's been caused from what's coming out of England and the lack of the finances, etc. So you can appreciate that monument and what it's saying, because it is reflecting the breakaway of the church in England from the Catholic Church in Europe. It's a very powerful story, and this all takes place again during Henry and Anne Boleyn's time. Well, actually, the demolition of the monasteries continues on after Anne Boleyn's time. And Anne Boleyn starts to become a very strong Protestant supporter. For example, we know the story of William Tyndale, the one responsible for the first English translation of the Bible. Sorry, the first printed English translation of the Bible, printed on the press. And he was a strong Protestant again who lost his life not long after this time, and became very strong friends with William Tyndale and was influenced very much by these Protestant thoughts that were coming from his direction. But it's about this stage also, while all this is going on and Henry's kind of listening to her in one ear, the eyes are going somewhere else again. And he realises that he's really in love with another. And so we've got to, what can we do here? So he trumps up a charge of adultery against Anne and charges her with treason. And as a result of that, she's sent to the Tower of London, and shortly after, she's beheaded. And when you go to the Tower of London today, every day, they have a reenactment of the beheading of Anne Boleyn. It was a very significant event in the history of the English people. And Anne Boleyn was beheaded as a result of what Henry did there at that stage. So we can start to see the conflict and the dimension now is building between Catholic and Protestant and what's happening right there in England. So now Jane Seymour comes along as the third of Henry's wives, and she had a good Catholic background too. And the interesting thing about Jane is that she probably was regarded by Henry as his favourite wife. He is buried today beside the grave of this lady, Jane Seymour, and he mourned longer than he did any other passing of any other wife for Jane. And the good news about Jane was, while she died as a result of the birth of her son, who became Edward IV on the throne, the good news for Henry was he got his long-loved son. So what he's been after all, through these first three wives has finally come to fruition through Jane Seymour. But sadly, he loses his wife over that birth as well. So look, there's the story of the first three, and now I'm going to hasten the story because I'm not going to give you the detail of Anne of Cleves, because that was only a few months' marriages, and that one was over. And then Catherine of Howard comes in, and again, she was only, I think, Anne of Cleves, I think, was 24 when she married Henry, who at that stage was probably something like in the vicinity of 48, was it? And Catherine Howard in the same year again, and Catherine Howard was only 17. And again, he marries her. But within 2 years, guess where she's gone? To the guillotine, to be beheaded. And same story as was for Anne Boleyn. And this brings us to the story of Catherine Parr. And it's here that I really would like to focus on what Catherine Parr has done. But now you've got the background as to what's going to happen during Catherine Parr's time. Catherine Parr, when she came to the throne, had a little mixture of Catholic and Protestant because she had, in fact, altogether she has 4 wives and she died at 36. So she had a pretty good reputation too. And one of those, did I say 4 wives? No, she had 4 husbands. She had 4 husbands and died at the age of 36, so you can appreciate that, she was a young woman, and the previous 2 marriages, one was a Catholic marriage and one was a Protestant marriage, and she kind of had a mixture of these, and so when she came into to power to be the queen, first of all, she did not want to do that. She fought against it. She argued against it. For example, her sister Anne, who had been a lady in waiting with all previous queens, her older sister said, "You're mad, you must." But Catherine just kept thinking but look what happened to them and how quickly each one was dismissed, and I'm only going to be another one. And she was not so keen to become involved in this. Her brother, William Parr, also a reformist, But he couldn't understand even the attitude of Catherine. It was a golden opportunity for her to share the Protestant cause before a king who had no sympathy for it. Well, finally she does become the queen. She had been a lady in waiting again in the previous couple of wives of Henry. And I guess, in fact, I got this out of the book here, and it's been popularised by a little opera, I guess. The phrase that apparently children in England, in this part of the history, have a little ditty that says, "Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived." And you can imagine Catherine at her wedding thinking, am I going to be the next? Particularly as Henry comes to the end of the wedding vows, "Until death do us part." You know, it was not a good start. But surprisingly, after a period of time, Catherine did develop a good relationship with Henry. And it was a mature relationship in terms of being able to communicate and talk with Henry. And over a period of time, she felt more confident to share with Henry what she was discovering in her own research, because becoming Queen of England obviously gave her an opportunity to become well informed and to be well educated and to seek out who she may to enlighten her further, whether it was about reform or reformist ideas, or just what it was. And she became a very educated woman and loved discussing with Henry some of this. And sometimes Henry would just shut down because he knew that his feelings were in one area and her feelings were in another area. Catherine also, and by the way, I'm not flicking it onto more photographs here. The only other photograph I can really show you for Catherine, because I've never been anywhere near any of Catherine's history to actually bring you photographs of it. But most of this part of the story takes place at the Hampton Court Palace, just out of London. And it was here that Catherine spends these 3-4 years with Henry as Queen of England and Ireland. The story goes on that Catherine Parr, and I'll just share this with you, one of the contributions that was made by Catherine Parr to the Protestant Reformation was, out of her learning, she decided that she wanted to herself write. Initially, the first 2 books you see there, the compiled books, Psalms of Prayers and then Prayers or Meditations, these were 2 books that were written by, or compiled by Catherine. She was not the author of these Psalms and Prayers, but she compiled them as a part of worship. And again, they reflected Protestant thinking, probably more than Catholic thinking, but it was pretty hard to do anything or to bring any charge against her from the compilation of those books, because quite a few people had an involvement with them. The next thing the next book that became a long work for Catherine Parr, and had people like Mary help her with this, Mary, who later becomes a queen who's going to oppose Protestantism, they took Erasmus's paraphrases upon the New Testament. Basically, it was just a New Testament translation in Latin that Catherine and her helpers translated into English. Wow, how valuable is that going to become in the years ahead to reformers as they go to the next stage of Reformation in England? So that was another piece that Catherine was responsible for. And then finally, Catherine wrote, and this wasn't finished until just after Henry died, and it was called The Lamentations of a Sinner. And Catherine very openly and honestly shared about her life as Queen of England and the wickedness of human nature and the forgiveness and love of God as was expressed, particularly in Protestant thought, with salvation by faith alone. And believe it or not, published the year following Henry's death or actually, no, it was even at the end of the year of Henry's death, because it was in 1547, when that book was published, and she was responsible for publishing it, and she wrote it all herself. When that book was published, it was the first English book that had been written in English and published by an English woman. And so you can appreciate that this is going to have an impact, particularly on the female agenda of the population. And after Catherine's time, there were certain books that became very prominent in the collection of Protestants, besides the Bible, which now was available in English, thanks to Catherine. And besides the Bible, there is Fox's Book of Martyrs, becomes just after this time as well, one of the must-have books of all Protestant libraries. Then there's this book, becomes a must-have book also of Protestant libraries. And so you can appreciate that this was a valued work and a significant contribution that Catherine made. And this, as we've mentioned, was something that came out of that experience of her becoming more informed, more involved in understanding what the Protestant thought was. Two more things I want to say about Catherine before we bring this to a close. One is the fact that Catherine was entrusted, and I don't have a photograph of it, so perhaps I'll go back to... No, I'll just stay on that one for now. Catherine was entrusted with stepmother role of Henry's earlier children, 3 of them. And that was, first of all, Mary of Catherine of Aragon. And by this stage, she was about, I think, in her mid-20s, so she was quite a elderly, not elderly, but an older youth, we'll say, of the royal family there. But Catherine, now very much entrusted, or cared for Mary, and they became more friends than they did become mother and daughter. But she became mother and daughter, I guess, to a couple of other, daughter and son, to a couple of other of Henry's children. One was, obviously, the son, at this stage, only a few years old when came into Catherine's care, and Elizabeth, a little older, but a little younger, when she came into Catherine's care. She was extremely young. In fact, I think it was only hardly more than a baby. And so Catherine had the responsibility of basically being the mother of these children, and you can appreciate that she was able to share with, particularly Edward and Elizabeth, Mary being older and her mindset already being formed, she was particularly able to influence these 2 children in strong Protestant thinking and theology, even though they were still fairly young children. But the mindset was commenced by Catherine and continued with other supporters of the Protestant cause after Catherine has to leave the court after Henry's death. The other point that becomes significant in the story also is that in the court, Catherine had to be extremely sensitive as to how she shared her reformist views and ways of thinking. She had privacy in her own chamber, and her maids in waiting and some other members of the court who were able to come in behind locked doors and discuss openly reformist views. But all of them, while they became strong supporters of reformist views, they outwardly did not display that in any way, because of what was happening in Henry's court is that there was a mixture of feelings by people like Thomas Cranmer, who supported Protestantism on the one hand, and then others who were very intent in getting the Church of England back into the Pope's quarters. And heads were rolling. Henry was sending Protestants and Catholics alike to be beheaded. in his confusion. Actually, Henry was quite confused over this in many ways. You'll see that in his actions and his behaviour. And so around the court, Catherine had to be extremely careful what she said, when she said, and who was around before she said anything. Sadly, this came to a head right at the, just before Henry died, this came to a head. And Catherine had spent quite a bit of time talking with Henry privately about Protestant reformist views, and Henry seemed to be becoming somewhat sympathetic about it, but it confused Catherine because there was no openness about it. The reason for that was something that had been said by Catherine in public and overheard by those who were trying to get rid of Catherine, knowing that she was a reformist in her thinking. When they heard this, they were able to take it to Henry, and they trumped up with Henry's signature at the bottom a heap of charges against her for which she would be beheaded. Catherine stumbled across a copy of those trumped up charges against her. It was her sister Anne who came to the rescue of Catherine and said, "You must go in and make it right with the king, otherwise your head's going to roll." She said, "No, look what happened to Anne Boleyn. She tried to do that and her head rolled." And by the way, sadly, even though the seventh marriage never took place, there was another woman that Henry had his eye on. And so eventually Catherine decides to go in before Henry and to explain to him that one of the purposes that she was openly sharing this thought with him was to create discussion and bring entertainment to him and for him to be better informed. And I guess a lot of other things went on with that, explanation and confession. But in the meantime, the plot had been put into effect, and a team were waiting outside, and it was time for Henry and Catherine to go for an evening walk around the gardens. And at a certain point, Catherine was to be captured by these opponents, to be taken and tried, charred, and beheaded. Well, there's Catherine and Henry walking out there. Remember, Henry's name is at the bottom of this. And up they turn at the right spot to capture Catherine, and Henry turned on them and dismissed them. This man's mind changes, like it changes. And he turned on them and sent them away. How dare they do that? And for the rest of Henry's days, which weren't many, Catherine had a protected role under the umbrella of Henry for that sudden change of mind. Well, Henry dies, and Catherine has to leave the court, but she's well looked after. And who should become queen at that stage? Sorry, not queen. Yes. No, get it right. Who should become queen? Let me go back to this if I can, please. On this slide, you'll see that I have now gone to red for Catholic and P for Protestant. And you'll notice that the firstborn child, from Henry's perspective for the throne, is a male heir. Edward gets the throne. But he's only a boy of 10 years of age and had ill health and only lasted till I think he was around about 16, something of that age, before he dies. But incredibly, in that boyhood framework, Edward had been trained in such a way that he supported, with Thomas Cranmer and others who continued the Protestant push and the reformist push in the court, he continued to make incredible changes that laid further foundations for the Protestant Reformation to take its roots in later years in England. And you would have to count Edward as being one of the strong Protestant forces at that time. However, after Edward, there came Mary, And this was another thing that we've got to credit Catherine for. Catherine also changed Henry's mind about, while Henry always said, no, Edward will be the one who follows me. But it was Catherine who changed Henry's mind about women in the line to the throne to actually take the throne. Henry's view was that women should never, ever take the throne. And if you look at English history, he wasn't the first to support that. There'd never been a woman on the throne in England prior to Mary. So Mary becomes the first English queen. Again, while she did a lot to reverse the work of Edward and any reformist who went before at that point of time in trying to get the church to come back to Rome, and certainly there was a lot of martyrdom that took place during the period of Mary, but her reign was not long. And then we have Elizabeth that comes to the throne. Elizabeth's reign was extensively long, not as many years as Elizabeth II, but she reigned for many years, and all the work of the former reformists throughout England was certainly taken up by Elizabeth. And while, yes, it was the High Church of England that was well supported, it became a strong Protestant church, and out of that High Church of England, other reformers went beyond to continue the Protestant Reformation in England. And so I'd like now to come back to this statement, a summary statement it is, for Catherine Parr as a reformist. What's the legacy she has left behind? There are three things I have mentioned. Her influence in her books in future English Protestant cause becomes very significant. Particularly that last book that she wrote, that became a gem for later Protestants in England, and also the translating of the Erasmus's Latin Bible into English. That was very significant for Catherine, and her influence went on. Secondly, there was direct influence upon the future Protestant monarchs, Edward and Elizabeth. They were young children in her hands. And she was able to mould their minds in such a way that they both continued to support the Protestant cause when they came to the throne. And for Elizabeth, that went on for years. And the last thing that probably becomes significant is the fact that in point 3, that Elizabeth actually had the opportunity to become Queen of England, to consolidate what she had been taught by Catherine. And so when you stop and have a look at the story of Catherine Parr, you suddenly begin to realise that here is a woman who quietly, in fact almost hidden, was able to bring about changes for the future Protestant cause, and they became very, very significant for Protestantism taking hold in England in years that followed after Catherine's death. In fact, she only, while she... I think it was the year 1547 that when Henry dies, that she was taken out of court, and she remarries the man that she wanted to marry before Henry proposed to her, and in childbirth she died. So that was a very sad end to Catherine. She may have been able to have had even further influence beyond what she had during the time while she was in court. But my thought with the story of Catherine Parr, I wonder if she ever sort of took out, like I have taken out, and that is, taken out those words out of the book of Ecclesiastes, and who knows but that you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. I wonder if she ever did, because her influence that went on beyond her time was very significant as far as the Protestant cause was concerned. And it seems very timely that she came to the kingdom when she did, in what she was able to do that was able to be reacted upon by later monarchs and later reformists. So I actually believe that this verse in Esther is kind of prophetic for an experience like Catherine Parr. But it's also kind of prophetic also for an experience for ourselves. Do we also sometimes, maybe sometimes you feel it's like, for example, when Elijah, I think it is confronted with these words. And I'm going to quote it in the King James. What doest thou here, Elijah? Do you sometimes feel like that? Whatever are you doing? Why are you here? Whether you're young or old, God can take you where you are, and he can have a purpose for where you are and make it extend into times beyond where you are. Just as Catherine, just as Elizabeth, just as, well, I guess for Elizabeth too, but just as Esther experienced. Yeah, have I come to the kingdom for a very special purpose? And I'd like to suggest to you that we don't just aimlessly drift through life without a purpose. God has a purpose for us wherever we are, whatever our circumstances, and he can use us to bring glory to him and to his name. And it's my prayer that we'll be able to see that in our journey today too.
Is the burden heavy as you bear it all alone? Does the road you travel harbor danger yet unknown? When you get discouraged, just remember what to do. Reach out to Jesus, he's reaching out to you. Is the life you're living filled with sorrow and despair? Does the future press you with its worries and its cares? Are you tired and friendless? Have you almost lost your way? Jesus will help you. Just call on him today. He's always there, hearing every prayer, faithful and true. Walking by our side, in his love we're hide all the day through. When you get discouraged, just remember what to do. Reach out to Jesus, he's reaching out to you.
Our Father in heaven, as we reach out to you, may it be that we be directed in an understanding that you have purpose and plans for each of our lives. Whether it's short or long, you can take us and use us for your purposes, and to that end we wish to dedicate our lives, we pray. Amen.